what's happened last time, and given that he was impeached for attempting to rig an election, and given the incredible disparity in the polls, what exactly has happened this year. But, that's something that takes time to figure out. So we're going to see.
Sarah, just one quick question, if you could. Do you think did you expect Joe Biden to kind of catch fire more than he has?
Not necessarily, because there's just too much going on this year. Like between the pandemic, the collapse of our democracy, the collapse of the economy, no one is going to catch fire. That same fear of abandonment is there for liberals and progressives. People are just generally speaking terrified. And I think there was some sense of, people felt assured by Joe Biden. Like Joe Biden grieves with us. Joe Biden understands human emotions. Joe Biden is loyal to the United States. Those are all baseline things that offer some sort of sense of reassurance. But I don't think that, him running was the great mistake here. I think refusing to prosecute Trump, and especially his criminal circle, who are all just running around free, getting pardoned and whatnot. I think that was the great mistake, because you're going up against an extremely powerful group of transnational criminals, autocrats, plutocrats, and so forth. That's very hard to defeat, and they use every dirty trick in the book. And so I don't think people should have expected a straightforward election, carried through by Joe Biden or by anybody else.
Okay, Sarah Kendzior, author of Hiding in Plain Sight. Thank you so much for joining us from Missouri tonight. All right, let's go to Detroit, Michigan. That's where Jeff Semple is. Jeff, what's happening in Michigan right now? Is it looking like the race may be close, I guess? Certainly it's coming down to battleground states like Michigan. What are you seeing there?
Well, that's right, Donna. I think we're getting starting to feel a little bit of deja vu here, watching that national map get colored in. As we've been reporting so far, states voting along the same lines for the same parties that we saw in 2016. Now, it's still early, of course, but that raises the possibility that we may see a similar ending, that the vote may well come down to these upper Midwest states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that had, before 2016, been considered the Democrats' blue wall. But of course, Trump came crashing through that, picking up these states for the Republicans for the first time in decades. So of course, Trump hoping for a repeat performance in that regard. And Biden had been leading in these states in the polls heading into this election. But thus far, Trump is in the lead. And it's been particularly interesting watching it play out here in Michigan. It's still early, of course, as we say, only about 40% of the votes have been counted, but Trump with about a 10 percentage point lead. So we're watching that closely and, wondering whether it may well once again come down to these battleground states in the upper Midwest, Donna.
Well, and that was the focus of both these campaigns. As you know, as we all know, both candidates crisscrossing the key states throughout the final days of the campaign. Do you think is it possible to say if that had any effect on turnout? It's probably not something that's tangible.
Well, yeah, it's a difficult thing to measure, of course, but we do know that this combination of a pandemic and a particularly polarizing president are expected to combine to create record voter turnouts in many states, including right here in Michigan, where, we've seen that every vote can really count. Michigan was the closest race in the 2016 presidential vote, decided for Donald Trump by fewer than 11,000 votes. And so, of course, getting out the vote is key. That's why we've seen both candidates swing through this region of the country so many times in recent days. And it's especially important, of course, in a pandemic and in communities that are grappling with poverty, like right here in Detroit. Detroit's unemployment rate before the pandemic was around 10%. Through the pandemic, it has soared to around 40%. I spoke earlier today with one woman who works as a steel worker, but the plant that she worked at was shut down back in December. She spent today with others driving people who don't have access to a car, who can't afford to get around, to polling stations to ensure that they could get out the vote. Have a listen.
Here in Michigan, we have one of the highest car insurance that's mandated in the state of all the states in the union, and a lot of people cannot afford it, especially now with 1/3 of the country out of work. They can't afford car insurance, so we're driving them to the polls free.
And those efforts may well be paying off, Donna. We've just received word and projections that Detroit is on pace to see its highest voter turnout in 20 years. And Detroit is a Democratic stronghold, could bode very well for Joe Biden, and he will need those votes, it would seem, if he's going to mount a comeback here in Michigan.
Yeah, because right now it looks like Michigan, which is a 16 electoral college votes, Donald Trump leading there by a fairly substantial margin, though. Not even 50% of polls reporting, I think. So there's lots of vote counting still to come. Jeff Semple, thank you so much. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment with live coverage of America Votes 2020.
Love you, Kitty. Quite nice. That's very sweet of you, love. Very cheap. Alright.
in Southwest Florida. Before we jump out here, I just want to give a quick thank you to all of our producers, our tech people, our behind the scenes that have been crunching
so
the numbers.
hard.
Thank you guys for what you do. We appreciate it. We'll be here to call the races on 10tampabay.com. Good night.
Good night. Bringing souls to the polls, as the Reverend told me. But at the same time, Republicans are also incredibly enthusiastic about their ground game. The party chair, Laura Cox, told me that they had 9 million voter contacts during this season, that every time they were out canvassing, they never saw any Democrats, and they cannot tell you enough about the enthusiasm that they see and they viscerally feel every time there are these giant rallies, so many of which took place in the battleground state of Michigan. And George, don't get me started on the lawn signs, but you see them all over. You know you're in a battleground in these suburbs when there's a Biden sign on one side, the Trump signs on the other. I went to a Trump volunteer meeting, a packed room, and the organizer said, how many of you have had your lawn sign stolen or vandalized? And almost the entire room's hand went up. It says something about just how tense the battleground is here out in the suburbs, George.
It sure does. I want to go to Mary Bruce right now. Mary, you picking up any concern in the Biden camp, picking up what John Carl was saying about the way the votes are coming in Michigan and how they're coming in?
The read from inside the Biden campaign right now is urging caution and patience. They say, look, they are feeling fine, and that is because this was expected. They knew that many of these key states, especially the blue wall states, were going to take some time. That said, there has been a bit of a shift in tone. Given the real enthusiasm, the real confidence that we were hearing from members of the Biden team heading into tonight, now you hear more the words hopeful, optimistic, but they were really bullish earlier in the night. Now, not so much of that. But, George, I have to tell you, behind me, they have started to bring in the cars here to this drive-in rally. If I'm really trying to pick at the tea leaves here, not sure what that means about whether we may or may not see Joe Biden later tonight. But, of course, he sort of changed his tune there, saying he may actually not speak until tomorrow.
But perhaps they will be ready for him to speak. We're going to keep an eye on that. And, of course, we're going to be here as long as the votes are being counted tonight. We're going to take another quick break right now. Election 2020 coverage continues right now. Joe Biden has 187 electoral votes. Donald Trump 114 electoral votes. It's a close one.
Welcome to Disney Plus. Are you ready? Drop in and explore. The action, the adventure, and the originals. There's no limit to what you'll find. These are your worlds. So come on, dive deeper into the universes you love. Wherever and whenever you want them, you'll find them all here on Disney Plus.
Now, when it matters most, the straightforward facts. ABC News is America's #1 news. #1 in the morning, #1 in the evening, and the #1 show on all of television. #1 in late night versus the competition. #1 in politics versus the competition. The #1 daytime talk show. And #1 in streaming news. Most trusted, most watched. ABC News is America's #1 news.
Now could be a good time to have another baby.
Are you crazy? I'm in love with you. Now that I said it out loud, it does sound weird. Please stop.
When I see you were so fine, I had to remind myself to breathe. I feel something when I see you.
Let's do this.
How's your quarantine going?
Admit it. These days, what you need to know
seems to change just about every day.
What is it that you really want to know, need to know?
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it. Feel smarter.
Feel better.
Feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America in the afternoon?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Lunchtime at 1 Eastern, 12 Central and Pacific on ABC. It's all about you.
Live from ABC News election headquarters in New York City, here again, George Stephanopoulos.
And we're back here at ABC News election headquarters in New York, 11:30 here in the East. And as we said, it's going to be a long night, a lot more counting ahead. It could spread over the next several days. And so that makes me want to bring back our legal team, our ballot watch team. I want to bring in Kate Shaw and Dan Abrams right now. And Kate, we just talked about Pennsylvania. We've had this Supreme Court ruling on how and whether and when ballots can be counted in Pennsylvania. It could prolong this process, could be more challenges ahead.
That's right. So actually, the Supreme Court has now twice had a chance to weigh in on this question of whether ballots that arrive between today and Friday can be counted under Pennsylvania law. Both times the court turned back challenges brought by Pennsylvania Republicans that would have cut off, the return date at today on Election Day itself. So right now, those ballots are going to be counted, but they're being segregated because the Supreme Court actually left wide open the possibility that it might take another look at this case after the election. And we don't know yet. And it's important, I think, to note that Justice Amy Coney Barrett is now in place. And there's a question about whether she might participate, which would, of course, give an additional vote when the court comes to considering this late arriving ballots question.
I want to bring that to Dan Abrams as well, because we all remember 2000 Florida. If it's close, that adds another layer of complication as well if you have recounts and have to have the ballots counted again. So first you have the challenges to the existing ballots and then the possibilities in a close race of recounts, and the court's getting involved in that.
Right. We've said in our room here, the legal room, we're only relevant if this thing is close. This thing is now close. And so as a result, the lawyers are all on speed dial. there's no question that there are going to be some form of legal challenges. We don't know exactly how real they will be, how significant, but Pennsylvania could become critical here. And as you point out, not just with regard to the 3 days of ballot counting, because there may not be that many votes in those 3 days. I think you could argue that the more critical question is going to be exactly how they're counting the variety of votes, the signatures matching, etc. And I think that those could be the critical questions here, even more than that 3-day window.
Okay, and Terry Moran, we saw how that played out in Florida in 2000.
We did, and one of the big questions here is how much will this conservative supermajority that is now in the Supreme Court defer to state Supreme Courts that find under state constitutions that these ballots should be counted, or will they reach into those states and federalize the question, decide it for themselves?
Okay, many questions ahead. We'll see if we get to them. We're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back.
Living large, but
holy cow, who is this person?
He stole approximately $8.1 million.
Really good. Wednesday on ABC.
Good Morning America tomorrow morning. Wake up to real-time answers, real-time results the morning after this historic election with the most powerful team in
I can't. It's going to be terrifying sometimes, I'm sure. But you don't. It's easy to say things when you don't actually have power, right? And it's easy to be critical of others when you're not in a position to be making the decisions. So, be that as it may. Let's talk a little bit about how policymakers and people behind the scenes in Ottawa are looking ahead to whoever becomes the next president, whether it's 4 more years for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. What do they do to prepare?
So they have been putting together intelligence reports on this from all levels of government, everything from CSIS, CSE, the intelligence, on the military side, what it could mean, looking at border states where they have concerns, and of course looking at the border itself. That is the biggest part of this relationship, and it has been closed due to COVID-19 since March. That is something that in a way has eased policymakers' minds because they didn't have to go into a more advanced posture around the border. That did not become somehow a story. But they are looking at all possible scenarios. If there's another Trump presidency, as we were saying, it's business as usual, as unusual as that business may sometimes be. They know what they're dealing with there. With Joe Biden, they'd have to make inroads. They'd have to deal with the fact that he has said one of the first things he'll do when he gets into office is to cancel Keystone XL. I spoke with Seamus O'Regan, who is the Minister of Natural Resources, on Sunday, and he said that the government will go to bat for that. But if they don't, well, now where is that oil in Alberta going? Serious problem. Biden also is an economic nationalist. He's a protectionist. So we wouldn't necessarily see a better trade relationship than we have under Trump. But there's no question that at the end of all of this, the critical things they're looking at is intelligence sharing. Canada is absolutely dependent on the United States for foreign operations and a lot of other things to get access to that intelligence. Military interoperability. We use a lot of the Americans' infrastructure overseas when we deploy. Of course, trade, the biggest thing by far for Canada. And at the end of the day, the friends and family relationships that we have across the border as well. I've been told by most of the experts around this, including senior people in the Prime Minister's office, in foreign affairs, in intelligence, in the military, they really expect that it will continue to be business as usual no matter who is elected. And that's because those relationships between Canadian institutions and American institutions are just so strong and so well developed that they tend to move on regardless of who the president is or how disruptive they might be.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's what ambassadors, former ambassadors, and current ones to the United States will say, is that they build relationships all around the president, not just here in Washington, but across the country, so that they have those ties and those people they can call when there are, tensions and frictions. All right, Mercedes Stevenson, thanks so much. Pleasure talking to you. We'll come back to you again, I'm sure. This election, of course, is not a popularity contest. It is possible for one candidate for president to win the popular vote, but not win the White House. And that's what happened in 2016. You'll remember when Hillary Clinton had nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, and yet she lost. He won the most electoral college votes, and that's what matters. Who wins a state's electoral votes is determined by the number of ballots cast for each candidate in each state, and that's why Donald Trump is prepared to fight for them in court, if need be. We're going to bring in David Schultz now. He's a constitutional law professor at the University of Minnesota. Professor Schultz, thanks so much for taking time with us. You know, we don't know the results yet, 11:37, and we're still waiting, and we knew it was going to be a long night. Possibly we won't see any final results as we all go to bed tonight. But when you see things that are this close, what can that tell us about the possibility of legal challenges in the days ahead?
It clearly goes up, and there's going to be a couple of possibilities that we can think of in terms of legal challenges. Of course, across the United States, in most states, if the margin of victory is less than, let us say, 0.5%, in those situations, there's usually mandatory recounts, and during those recounts, there could be challenges in terms of in terms of what, let's say, the voter intent, are the ballots accurately being counted, and all that's a source of litigation. But I think for this election, the biggest source of potential litigation coming after the election is going to be regarding whether or not ballots that were received after Election Day can be counted for the purposes of the vote in that state. And I think that's where the Trump campaign is working very hard to say that these people who are mailing in ballots that are arriving, let's say, tomorrow or after the election is over tonight, should not be counted.
And how concerned are you about that playing out and potentially a lot of these mail-in ballots not counting?
This is potentially a problem. In my state of Minnesota, where I am right now, a federal court ruled very recently that ballots that were tentatively going to be allowed to be able to be postmarked on Election Day, but counted up until 7 days, if they're received up till 7 days after the election, might not be counted. And that potentially disenfranchised several 100,000 people in Minnesota. I don't know if those ballots are going to matter, but needless to say, it's an issue, it's a concern. And I think for many voters, and this has been one of the concerns they've had, is that potentially we could see tens of thousands, I'm going to say, correct myself, we could see millions of votes potentially being thrown out if they arrive after Election Day, and that could be the margin. And we're looking at states right now, such as, for example, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, which are very close, which have a lot of outstanding ballots, perhaps ballots that are going to be coming in the next couple of days. And in some cases, the courts have said that's okay, and we're going to see probably a renewed battle if these are very close states in terms of whether or not those ballots should actually be allowed to be counted.
So let's say that happens, worst case scenario, and there are a whole bunch of these legal challenges. How do you see that scenario playing out, and how long could it be before we have results in those really tight races?
Well, what we have to think about is a series of hard deadlines here that, remember, as you said before, that it's not the popular vote nationwide that determines the election, it's the Electoral College vote. And the Electoral College has to cast their ballots in all the different 50 states on December 14th. So we're looking at this having to be resolved. This litigation has to be resolved relatively quickly, about 5 weeks. But any kind of litigation here probably will take place maybe starting in the next couple of days. But if the ballots are still being counted, we might not see litigation initiated for at least a week, which puts us into some very, very tight deadlines for recounting ballots or potentially for throwing out ballots. And so we are under an even tighter deadline now than we were 20 years ago in Florida with Bush v. Gore, because here we've had some courts extend the time period for voting beyond Election Day, and that itself is going to be the source of litigation.
You know, I wanted to ask you that because this isn't the first time that there's been a potentially a dispute after an election. In 2000 is the one that obviously comes to mind. I think it was 36 days before Al Gore conceded. So potentially you're seeing a similar time frame?
I'm seeing roughly the same time frame that, again, we're looking at. Again, roughly about 5 weeks out is when the Electoral College will be casting their votes. You probably have to get most of the disputes regarding the electoral votes resolved within a few days before that. So I'm going to put us on the clock that says you probably have approximately 4 weeks to resolve these disputes. And again, if if the results are still coming in a week or so, and we go to litigate, or somebody goes to litigate at that point, I should say, it makes it very, very difficult to meet some of those timeframes. And if those timeframes aren't met, then potentially we throw the Electoral College determinations for electoral votes into the next Congress, into January 6th, 2021, which is when Congress is supposed to verify and count the electoral votes.
Yikes. Professor Schultz, one quick question. The Supreme Court probably going to play a role if this plays out the way you're talking.
You're absolutely correct. And so this could be possibly a replay of 2020. But I think for many people, the concern is now with the Donald Trump having put 3 justices on the Supreme Court. I think the Democrats' worst fear is what? That he's packed the court successfully to be able to keep himself in office.
All right. Professor David Schultz in Minneapolis tonight. Thanks so much for explaining that for us. Let's go to our Washington Bureau Chief, Jackson Proskow. Jackson, were you able to hear what Professor Schultz was saying? It's hard to comprehend that this country could possibly be in that long a period of uncertainty.
It is. I've heard views that are just as dire and views that are slightly more optimistic, even from Democrats here. But I think the fact of the matter is that Republicans have been very aggressive in their attempts at trying to challenge this in the courts preemptively, and that was before we had a result. I mean, they were in court in Nevada this week trying to stop the count of early ballots. They went to court in Texas to try and throw out 125,000 ballots that were cast in good faith at drive-through voting sites, which Republicans had initially been on board with only after they saw how close the state might become. And that was sort of the preview, the first act. So the fact that you might see further court challenges once we get a sense of how close things could be should not surprise anybody.
And when will we get a sense of how close things are in those, like Pennsylvania? I mean, we're not even going to know that, really, for a couple of days.
Yeah, I'm looking at potentially 5 states tonight where it's going to be too close and we may not have a result tonight. Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Now, the last 3 there, we knew from the outset we wouldn't have a result because of the mail-in ballot counting. Georgia, there's been some problems counting. North Carolina, it's just too close. So chance is good we don't have a result tonight just because Democrats haven't managed to flip any other states, with potentially the exception of Georgia. That hasn't officially been called yet. Some U.S. media outlets are calling it. And we should point out the Trump campaign is pushing back on that. They think they've still got it locked up.
Interesting. 11:44, and we're still not sure. All right. Jackson Proskow, thanks so much. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. You are watching America Votes 2020. Tracy Tong is next.
Let's take another check at the numbers now. In the race to 270, Joe Biden with 209 electoral votes right now, Donald Trump with 118, and lots of movement within states as the vote count continues. Let's take another look at the map right now. These states that you see colored solid red or solid blue are the ones that have been decided. The electoral votes in each of those states add up to those numbers that you see at the bottom of the screen at this point in the night. And of course, they are rapidly changing. This map so far, though, still looks the same as it did in 2016. Let's bring in Eric Sorensen now. Eric, still a number of swing states and toss-up states yet to be called. As you've mentioned, Arizona could be the first one to go the other way if Joe Biden is able to take it there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about when you look at that map and you look at the numbers for Biden, and they don't look bad relative to Trump right now, but you could kind of see that it's going to start to grind more slowly for the Democrats at this point. Yes, they may pick up Arizona, but it's hard to see what else they're going to pick up much as they try to get to 270, whereas there are several states that you were looking at on that map that aren't colored in yet, but they're starting to look like they're going to go for the Republicans and for Trump. So if Texas goes, that's going to add a whole bunch of electoral votes, et cetera. So that gap could close up quickly, which brings us then to the races everyone has been talking about all along, which is Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If we start with Wisconsin, you'll see that at the moment, Trump has a lead there. We can't make too much of it because although it says 81% of the polls, we don't know which ones are still outstanding, but a 5-point lead is not insignificant. We looked at one tiny county, for instance, Douglas County. Clinton won it by 2,000. Trump is winning it by 1,500. And so, you know, when you turn around those numbers, 2,000, 3,000 at a time, you start to build up the lead he has, which is at the moment more than 100,000. So Wisconsin is a little bit dicey in terms of the polls right now. Michigan, there's still a lot outstanding to look at in Michigan. The race there is still in favor of Donald Trump. It's only half the polls, not even quite half the polls, but he has a healthy lead in Michigan. So this would not be a good outcome, obviously, for Biden. There are still some paths to victory for Biden, but let's go on to Pennsylvania and look at that. Pennsylvania right now shows quite a big lead with half the polls counted for Trump. But there are counties with a lot of votes to count that would go to Biden probably. We were looking at Montgomery County. Clinton won that 3-1. That Biden is leading that 3-1 in Montgomery County. Clinton barely won that 2-1. And there's only 50% of the votes counted in that county. So there are a lot of Democratic votes still to come in Pennsylvania. But I think, Tracy, one other thing that's going to happen now is that the arithmetic is going to start to kick in. And how do you get to 270? And you know that Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin number, Trump doesn't need all of them. If he wins everything he won in the past, he only needs one of them.
Right.
But go ahead.
And I was going to ask you before you go, actually, in the polling leading up to Election Day, we did see Biden showing a lead there before. And tonight, of course, we're seeing early results trickle in. Nothing decided in those states yet. If you're Joe Biden, what are you thinking at this point?
I'm thinking, that I'm a lot less sure of how things are. Behind the scenes, maybe they weren't as sure. But the Democrats were sure talking like they had a lot of paths to victory. Those paths are running out at this point. It looks like it's going to involve 2 or 3 of these states that we're talking about, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Put Arizona into the mix. You do that, he could afford to lose Wisconsin, but he has to replace it with Arizona, and then he would still have to win Michigan and Pennsylvania. It's those kinds of numbers now, and you're down to those few states. And there are a couple of others that aren't necessarily even in the bag for Biden at this point, like Nevada. Not very many votes are in yet, but he needs that one for sure. And then he'll have to see how all of these votes start to come in for these battleground states in the Midwest.
Okay, Eric, thank you. Well, there is still a lot to look at in the Midwestern states, of course. Let's bring in Clifford Young, president of Ipsos U.S. Public Affairs once again. Clifford, good to see you again. We hope that we have that technical issue figured out now. At this point, the map showing declared winners is looking very similar to what it looked like in 2016. I want to ask you, according to your polling, did you expect this?
Well, first and foremost, I think that obviously Trump is outperforming the polls at this point. But I want to really caveat that because as we look at the votes coming in, they're just different patterns in the past. We have to be very careful because the same-day voting is much more Republican than early voting, and we still don't know how they're going to phase over time. And so ultimately, how the polls are actually will only be determined probably later this week. That said, Trump leads the upper.
Okay, Clifford, I think we've lost your audio again. Apologies. We will come back to you, if possible, a little bit later on. But let's head over now to Mike Armstrong, who joins us from Philadelphia. Actually, we're going to head to Mike in just a little bit as well. Okay, we are hearing that Mike is ready. Hello, Mike. Mike is in Philadelphia,
Absolutely.
Pennsylvania.
Hi,
Mike,
good evening.
we are hoping to get updated on the numbers in Pennsylvania. So what's the latest on that?
Well, I'd say don't hold your breath, basically. What we're hearing is that Philadelphia has actually stopped counting mail-in ballots for the night, and that might have a lot to do with why Pennsylvania is in the Donald Trump camp. At least that's why it's leaning so far in that direction. Only about 76,000 of this city's mail-in ballots have been tallied so far out of about 350,000. Counting is supposed to resume tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Statewide, there's still more than 1 million mail-in ballots that have been counted, and it's early. And those ballots are expected to lean more to Joe Biden, so it could have a big impact. The Secretary of State here has been saying for days that it will take days to have final numbers here in Pennsylvania, and it looks like she's right.
And Mike, the fight over advanced voting has been bruising in Pennsylvania, very partisan. What are state officials saying there tonight?
Yeah, the Secretary of State had a press conference probably about 20, 25 minutes ago. One of the things she's talking about are calls by Republicans here in Pennsylvania for her to resign. She's turning it around and saying they're the ones who should resign. They should resign, she says, over they're fighting pre-canvassing. She points out that 46 other states in the U.S. allowed pre-canvassing, sort of pre-processing the early ballots before the polls close today. Some polls here in Pennsylvania, some counties will only start processing those mail-in ballots tomorrow. So it's a really slow process here. There's also a battle brewing in Lancaster County. There's an extension where postmarked ballots can arrive up until Friday at 5 p.m. Now, Lancaster's not too happy about that. Officials in that county sent a letter to the Secretary of State. They're saying they won't tally ballots that come in during that extension because that extension could be overturned eventually by the U.S. Supreme Court. It's expected that Republicans will be fighting for that. So those ballots were supposed to be kept separate, but counted. The chair of the county commissioners wrote to the Secretary of State that those ballots they don't feel can be removed from the count if they're tallied up. Here's what he said. A majority of the board exercised our legal authority to comply with the law and your first set of guidance and to wait and canvass any ballots that come in after Election Day. So there you go, Tracy. The battles are really just beginning.
Mm-hmm. And we know that Trump and Biden spent a lot of time during this campaign in the Keystone State. Do you think that really made any impact?
You know, it's unbelievable how much time they spent. I lost track of how many times they came. One of the things that probably had an impact is the fact that Joe Biden does have quite a few ties to this community. Each state in the U.S. has 2 senators, and when he was the senator in the neighboring state of Delaware, people used to call him Pennsylvania's 3rd senator. That's how tied to this state he was. We haven't seen those numbers yet or the impact that those ties might have had. That could come in later as those mail-in ballots are counted. Because as I said earlier, they are expected to lean a little bit more towards Biden, especially since a lot of them are coming from the bigger metropolitan centers, especially Philadelphia, the biggest city in this state.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Mike is in Philadelphia tonight. And again, you are watching America Votes 2020. Still lots to be counted, and we have a lot more coming up for you on our show. We will return to Donna Friesen from Washington soon.
Hello, I'm Donna Friesen. It is now midnight in Washington, D.C., midnight Eastern Time, as we continue our live coverage. To viewers from Atlantic Canada, welcome to you, right through to Saskatchewan on Global TV and nationally across the Global News Radio Network. Thanks for listening. Many viewers are also streaming us live on the Global TV app, Amazon Prime Video, YouTube, and of course, globalnews.ca. So welcome to all of you. It's, as I said, after midnight. All the polls are now closed across the U.S., except for a few in Alaska and I guess Hawaii. Not sure about that. And we don't know who is going to be president in 2021. It's still not clear. In fact, the map right now looks, get this, pretty much the same as it was in 2016. In fact, not a single state has flipped, although some U.S. networks have called Arizona for Joe Biden, which would be a flip. It was Republican last time. We haven't made that call yet. We get our numbers from Associated Press, though Joe Biden is leading in Arizona. The number that matters to get to the keys to the White House is 270. That's how many electoral college votes you need to win. Right now, you can see there, Joe Biden has 209 electoral college votes and Donald Trump has 118. Here's what the electoral college map looks like right now. As expected, Biden has held states on the east and west coast. Donald Trump is doing well in the south and the Midwest. The big question marks, all those gaps in the map that don't have colors on them. Places like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, votes there are still being counted. It's unclear which way those states might swing. And as we've been telling you since the beginning of this night, counting could take a very long time in some of those states, days in some of those states. Here's a look behind the scenes tonight in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Election workers, there they are, busy.
Started in my state of California, the whole West Coast and beyond.
That's Nancy Pelosi. You know, it's not the kind of night the Democrats were hoping for. Eric Sorensen's been looking at the results come in. I know there's not a clear result yet. We certainly don't know who's going to be president. We've said that from the beginning of this night, that it's very possible there would be no clear result tonight. But Eric, this is not the night that the Democrats were hoping for, not the night Joe Biden was hoping for at this point.
No, I mean, there's the clarity that was expected to be perhaps a runaway or a clear win by Biden has turned into a race that is going to be very close. Those numbers again on the bottom of the screen that say Biden 213, Trump 118, sure, but pretty soon after these numbers, a lot of the states that are going to report over the course of the next, number of hours are likely to add to Trump's column and not to Biden's column. I don't know if we have the map available, but we can look at it and you can see that this map has not changed at all from 2016. And if you sort of just take that logically to the end, it means if you go all the way to the end and 2016 is the same, Trump wins by about 60 electoral votes. Now, it's not going to be that way, but some of those states across the South, like Texas and Florida, these at the moment are looking like they may go to Trump. And if that happens, we're back to that calculation of the firewall that the Democrats, this is why they were campaigning there over and over and over again. They recognized that at the end of the day, if they couldn't pull off some of these surprise wins in the South, they were going to have to retreat and go back and inside their fortresses win back Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And none of that looks very certain right now. We can show you Arizona, for example. This would be one highlight for the Democrats so far tonight. Joe Biden looks like he's in pretty good shape to win that. If that were to happen, he could trade it off, say, for Wisconsin, because right now he's trailing in Wisconsin, but not by too much. But there are, 84% of the polls are reporting it's not very comfortable in Wisconsin at the moment. There may be a couple of others up in that way that we were talking about if we have Michigan or Pennsylvania. Here's Pennsylvania. Yeah, Mike Armstrong was talking about this a little while ago, that there are a lot of votes that aren't even going to be started counting until tomorrow. So that's something. And some of these counties, the collar counties as they call them, like Montgomery and Delaware and Chester County around Philadelphia, there's still a lot of votes to count there. But you can see now that this is turning into a very close race, Donna. This is not what was expected, I think, by Democrats. It's almost, in that way, that it's almost a repeat of 4 years ago that they started out with high hopes and all of a sudden they're just wringing their hands now because it's not at all a sure thing.
You know, a lot of parallels to 2016. In fact, that's what President Trump said before the polls closed anywhere, that he thought he could be a repeat of 2016, or except he thought they might do better than 2016. Eric, can you look at Florida for us? Because I know that's a notoriously close state. Can you tell us, I noticed on our map that it hasn't been colored red or blue yet. How close is it right now?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the only thing you can say about the last few percentage points is that there is no confidence yet that they can say that those almost 400,000 votes couldn't be made up. But Florida is looking very much like it's going to Trump. I mean, people have more or less, I think, I've stopped looking at it because his lead just was too big. This is a state that normally is within a point or two.
I noticed on our map it wasn't red, so that's why I was asking you about it, because I think other places, other networks have called it. I know there are reasons why we haven't, but it looks like Trump is in 100% of the polls reporting there. It looks like he's taken Florida.
Yeah, out of an abundance of caution, perhaps, or it may just not have flipped over in our technology. But yeah, I think we don't have to anguish over Florida for any longer, and the Trump team, I think, can kind of relax and breathe a sigh of relief about Florida. And the Biden team has got to move on to some other states now to see where there's some possible victories, because even though he has the lead, as we say, in those numbers at the bottom of the screen, there aren't that many out there that look like he can get him to 270 unless he starts turning some of those numbers around in places like Pennsylvania.
And are you seeing signs of that happening in other states? We were talking about Nevada earlier, because that was a state that the former U.S. ambassador to Canada mentioned was possibly in play for the Democrats. Is there anything coming up in Nevada yet?
They had to extend the voting times in Nevada, so the results are coming in very late from Nevada. There isn't a lot of data to report there yet. But, when the ambassador was talking about having Nevada in the mix, what he means by that is we can't afford to lose Nevada. They won it in 2016, and you can see by the way the numbers are going now, they got to hang on to everything they had and see what else they can add. Yeah. Arizona looks promising, but they've still got to win at least 2 out of the 3 in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and at the moment, they're not leading in any of those 3.
Okay, Eric, we're going to come back to you. Thanks so much, as always. Let's go to our Washington Bureau Chief, Jackson Prosco. It's after midnight, Jackson. We talked earlier about whether we might hear from either of these candidates tonight, and both of them had signaled, or at least Joe Biden had said, he's going to talk at some point. And Donald Trump had said there's going to be a clear victory tonight, and the American people deserve to have a clear victory tonight. Well, it's now tomorrow, at least Eastern time. There is no clear result. Do you think we're going to hear from either one of them?
Yeah, before I address that, I just want to fill in the blank for you on why we don't have a call on Florida from the Associated Press.
Yes,
they just put out a note here saying they're waiting on more vote counts, specifically from South Florida, including Miami-Dade County, which is the largest county in the state. Yes. So that's what they're waiting for. It's factors like that, I think, that are going to play into whether we hear from either candidate tonight. One thing I think that could push Donald Trump into making some sort of declarative statement tonight, though, is there's a fight over a call that Fox News has made over the state of Arizona. And they've come out early. They are the only ones calling Arizona for Joe Biden right now.
Which was a surprise, because it's Fox News and they called it for Biden. And that's the only state that is flipped, right, from Republican to Democrat.
Exactly. But the Trump campaign is absolutely livid about this. They are tweeting up a storm. Jason Miller, who's a senior advisor to the president, is tweeting up a storm right now, imploring other media outlets not to follow suit. They're saying way too soon to be calling Arizona, way too soon. We believe over 2/3 of outstanding Election Day voters are going to be for Trump. So you have to wonder if that's what the Trump campaign is publicly telegraphing about what they feel the state should be doing, if they might come out and make some sort of declarative statement about the overall election. But at the same time, states like Pennsylvania have 2.2 million outstanding ballots. They are not getting those counted tonight.
Yeah,
they're not having a result tonight.
At this point, fields don't matter, do they?
They certainly
really,
do not.
It's not about that. It's about the math. It's about
Exactly.
counting. And as you say, in Pennsylvania, it's millions of votes that we're not going to know.
2.2 million, yeah.
And is it still potential? I mean, I know there are other battleground states we're talking about too, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, still in play, it seems. But before this all started, Pennsylvania was such a key. Is that what you're still seeing?
Absolutely. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, the 3 states where Republicans at the state level made sure that we could not have an early count of those mail-in ballots and would be in a situation where we wouldn't have a result on election night. Go figure.
Yeah, so there we are. 12/11, now November the 4th. In Eastern time, at least. I know you people on the West Coast are still behind, but it feels like it's been a long time, and we don't have a conclusion. But we did know that was going to be the case. Jackson, thanks. We're going to come back to you for sure because we're not going anywhere. Let's go to just outside the White House, I believe, is where Reggie Cecchini is here in D.C. Reggie, there was, some crowds gathering there. What's it like now?
Hey, Donna, the crowds here kind of ebbed and flowed. We've been down here for the last 7 hours or so, and it was a much larger crowd when we first arrived. But they kind of come, they kind of go, and that's kind of been how the game has been played for the better part of the evening now into the early morning hours. But you really couldn't ask for 2 more dynamically different atmospheres. Just a couple of 100 meters behind me inside the White House, President Trump is hanging out with well-wishers and confidants and loyalists, kind of sipping on drinks and having hors d'oeuvres. Where on the front door of the White House, just outside of it, on the other side of the fence that it's been barricaded behind, it is an emotionally charged atmosphere. People here are politically exhausted, and they're on edge, much like the rest of the country is, looking to try and get some kind of answer from anybody to try and figure out what the end of the night is going to look like here. And that kind of speaks to that ebb and flow crowd. Oftentimes you'll see people come in and start marching through. And we have to remember that the crowds that gather here in Black Lives Matter Plaza, it's not solely linked to this election. There are a large number of social justice issues that have kind of come from this community hub over the last several weeks and the last several months. And that's where some of those chants and calls come to. They're pushing back on the Trump administration's policies, but it's also worth noting that this is a group that's also not fully here to back Joe Biden. They're simply the younger cohorts, those Generation Zs and those millennials looking for change, calling for change, and using this as a platform for them to yell across the fence into the White House to say that they are here not to get rid of Donald Trump, but to get rid of the policies in this country.
All right, Reggie Cecchini, thank you. Hey, Reggie, can I ask you before you go, you mentioned exhaustion, political exhaustion. You've worked in Washington for a long time now. Is it fair to say that there is a level of exhaustion? This has been a grueling campaign that has taken place in the middle of a pandemic. So many people have lost their jobs, no family members who have died or gotten very sick. What's your sense of just the kind of exhaustion level of the American people?
Well, I think there are 2 factors here. It is not just political exhaustion from what we've been dealing with over the last 9 or 10 months with a campaign that has kind of coincided with a pandemic that has impacted, next to every single person in this country. It is kind of culminating into what has been 4 years of exhaustion in this country. President Trump has been pushed back on and criticized from the day that he was elected 4 years ago. And I think that has played into where people are right now, pushing back on policies, whether it has to do with social injustices or whether it has to do with criminal justice reform or whether it has to do with this pushback on science, whether it has to do, with climate change or where we are with the coronavirus. It really has been an exhausting moment for Americans, and I think they're simply just looking for any kind of change. And if Donald Trump wins another 4 years, I don't see that this plaza is going to become some kind of bastion of happiness, but I think that this is going to lead to further either exhaustion or further calls for some kind of change. And I think that if we end up seeing a shift tonight in the political stronghold, especially in the Senate and in the House, if Donald Trump, maintains the White House, we could see some kind of, legislation that helps out these years worth of cries for some kind of change.
It's interesting, Reggie. I just walked by the White House the other day, and, I was last year for the midterms, and there was some sense of, anxiety then, but nothing like there is now. At the level of security around the White House, the fencing that's around there, you can't get anywhere near the front of it. It just doesn't. I know I'm old, but it doesn't feel like the America I remember. And I think there are lots of people who are hoping that there's some kind of a peace descends on this country that doesn't exist now.
Yeah, I mean, look, even 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when I first arrived here, we didn't have these barricades that were surrounding Lafayette Square in front of the White House. This was kind of the People's Park that was in front of the People's House. And as the years went by and as more people kind of angrily pushed back on President Trump's policies, we saw that the Trump administration lashed out by isolating the president further. And this has become a moment of criticism for the administration, where the president keeps himself barricaded inside, essentially ignoring the crises that are happening on his front step. And I think that there is an opportunity here for America to try and change its ways. Look, we're in a city right now where the buildings have been boarded up, fearing that there could be some kind of unrest tonight if the president were to come out and make some kind of premature victory announcement, or if people just didn't like the way that the numbers were going. But at the end of the day, these boards that are up on buildings right now, some of them didn't come down after those protests that took place in May and June. So this really has been a city, a district, and it joins the rest of the states that have just been on edge for the better part of this year and for the last 4 years.
All right, Reggie Cecchini outside the White House tonight. Thank you so much. We're going to bring in Jackson Brosco again. Jackson, we were talking just a little while ago about whether we'd likely hear from Donald Trump or Joe Biden tonight. You've got some news on that.
Yeah, Donna, in about 15 minutes here, we're expecting that Joe Biden is going to make an address to the nation. The press pool that travels with him has been summoned, and he's now heading to the venue that they have in Wilmington, Delaware. There's no declarative statement that Biden can make at this point because there's not enough information to call the race. It's likely that his message will be about patience and unity and allowing the vote count to proceed unhindered in all these states that still need to tally up these millions of ballots.
That's kind of extraordinary, is it not, to have a presidential candidate come out and speak, and presumably neither a victory speech nor a concession before the count is done?
It is, but I think it fits with where we thought this night might go, which is that we knew we'd be in for a long haul, not necessarily have a definitive answer tonight. And now that you look at the fact that you've only really had one state so far that seems to have flipped for Joe Biden, that being Arizona, potentially. Again, that hasn't been formally called yet. I think you can see why it's in his interest to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't come out and perhaps try and claim some sort of victory tonight, or claim that he's on the path to victory at this point, because the fact of the matter is neither man can say where they're headed as of right now.
Well, we know that Donald Trump, at least we were told, he's inside the White House now watching the results come in. And he did say earlier that he wanted a result today. It's not happening. He's not going to want to hear Joe Biden speak before he does, right? That'll probably get him going.
Yeah, I mean, it does leave him the chance to have
the last word on the evening. And I will say, for Democrats who are watching this is not the 2016 situation where it was almost 2 o'clock in the morning and John Podesta came out and said, folks, we're not going to settle this tonight, when in fact the die had been cast. It was very clear that Hillary Clinton was not going to win. She just wasn't going to give a concession speech at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is something different. This is an election that is still in progress. We know it's going to take time to get a result.
All right, well, we'll wait to hear when Joe Biden speaks. It should be coming up fairly shortly. Jackson Brosco, thanks. Let's go to Detroit. Jeff Semple is there in the state of Michigan. Jeff, Michigan very much still in a state of play. I think the Associated Press has not called Michigan yet. 16 electoral votes in that state. And is it right that Donald Trump is leading now, though not all the votes have been counted?
Well, that's right, Donna. And as we've been reporting, the electoral map so far looking, very similar to the one that we saw developing back in 2016 when Donald Trump became president. And if that's true, of course, that raises the very real possibility that it may all come down to a handful of states here in the upper Midwest, the Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the so-called Democratic blue wall that Donald Trump crashed through back in 2016, taking those states for the first time in decades. And if we look at the numbers now, including, right here in Michigan, it would look at this hour like Donald Trump is indeed pulling ahead. Half the votes or so have been counted. He's got about a 10 percentage point lead. However, some important context to keep in mind at this hour while we're looking at those numbers, Donald Trump was expected to see an early lead, according to some of the experts we've been talking to, and that is because Republican voters more likely to vote in person, Democrats more likely to vote via mail-in ballot because of concerns about COVID-19 and the pandemic. And those absentee ballots, by their very nature, take longer to count and longer to report. So it's possible that what we are really seeing in Michigan and Wisconsin with Donald Trump in the lead is a delay from those mail-in ballots, those absentee ballots. We've certainly seen a record number of them here in Michigan, more than 3 million absentee ballots. It's very possible that that's what's happening, and that's why it looks like Donald Trump is well in the lead when perhaps he isn't. A long way to go, still very early. We do know, Donna, though, we have heard, in fact, just in the last hour or so from Michigan State Secretary, called a press conference to say that a bit of good news. We had been talking in this state about possibly waiting until Friday to hear a conclusive result. We're now hearing from officials in the state that they expect to have a final result in Michigan by this time tomorrow, by Wednesday evening. And that's, of course, good news, especially if it does all come down to these states once again.
All right, well, you and I won't be sitting here in exactly the same clothes if that happens tomorrow, but I will be talking to you again, I'm sure.
Ears open.
Jeff Semple, you can put a new tie on. Jeff Semple in Detroit tonight, thank you. Racism, law enforcement, and inequality are long simmering issues in the United States. We know that, and we want to explore some of those issues with Ted Johnson. He joins us from Washington. He's a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice